The humid air of Port Blossom hung heavy, thick with the scent of brine and pine, as I helped Finn, my 11-year-old, secure his seatbelt in the battered passenger van. Behind us, the unassuming stone facade of the county courthouse seemed to shrink in the rearview mirror, just another building marking an ordinary Tuesday. But inside, my 20-year marriage had just been dissolved, the ink barely dry on the decree. Leo, my 14-year-old, silently climbed into the front seat, his gaze fixed on the horizon, trying to project an air of indifference he clearly didn't feel. Years of sanding hulls and hauling timber had taken their toll on my body, and my left knee throbbed a familiar ache that intensified with stress. I leaned against the van door for a moment, the worn leather of the steering wheel cool beneath my palms. "Dad?" Finn's small voice broke the silence from the back. "Yeah, buddy, are we still a family?" His question hit me like a rogue wave. I'd braced myself for anger, for accusations, for tears, but not for that raw, fundamental query. I cleared my throat, the words catching. "We always will be, Finn. Always." It wasn't perfect, but it was the truth I clung to. We pulled onto the coastal highway, the rhythmic creak of the old van's suspension a backdrop to our quiet. Country music, tinny and faded, played from a speaker that had long outlived its prime. The world outside looked normal, fishing boats bobbing in the harbor, the distant cry of gulls, the familiar stretch of coastline, but nothing felt normal. Elara, my now ex-wife, had walked out of that courthouse with the lion's share. The house, most of our savings, a settlement that made Mr. Davies, my attorney, wince visibly. And if the whispers in Port Blossom were to be believed, she'd also walked away with the more sympathetic narrative. The long-suffering wife, the emotionally distant boat builder, the marriage that foundered because he cared more about his craft than his family. To be honest, there was a kernel of truth in that. I had spent too many years believing that providing for my family was enough. Coastal Craftworks, my boat restoration and repair business, was my lifeblood. I poured myself into it, working long hours, missing school plays, skipping family vacations, always promising myself I'd make it up later. But later, as it often does, arrived before I was ready. A sudden buzz from Leo's phone jolted me. He glanced at the screen, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly, then handed it back to me. "You should probably see this, Dad." My stomach dropped. It was a group photo, a table full of grinning faces. Elara, her parents, her younger sister and brother-in-law, and Julian Thorne, the charming property developer she'd insisted was just a friend until shortly before she filed for divorce. Champagne flutes gleamed. Everyone was beaming, their smiles almost blinding. The caption, innocently posted by one of Leo's cousins in the wrong family chat, read, "To new beginnings." For a fleeting moment, a searing anger flared within me. Not because they were celebrating, but because they couldn't even wait a single afternoon. Then something unexpected happened. Finn leaned forward, peering at the screen. "Is Mom with Julian?" Kids, I thought, miss nothing. I glanced at Leo, who stared resolutely out the window. "Your mom," I said carefully, "is making her own choices right now." Finn nodded slowly, unconvinced. Neither was I. We stopped at a gas station just outside of Gull's Landing. About 20 minutes down the road, the boys wanted snacks. I needed coffee. As I stood in line, my phone buzzed. It was Mr. Davies. I stepped outside, leaning against the rough brick wall by the ice machine. "Everything okay, Mr. Vance?" he asked. There was a strange, almost anticipatory pause. "Actually," he said, his voice lower, "something interesting just happened." My pulse quickened. "What? You remember that trustee we discussed last month?" "Mr. Finch?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Exactly. He just contacted me." I looked across the parking lot. Cars pulled in and out, people pumped gas, oblivious. My life, I realized, was changing again, unseen by anyone around me. "What did he say?" Mr. Davies lowered his voice further. "He reached out to Elara's attorney. About 10 minutes ago. 10 minutes ago. Roughly the same time they would have been raising champagne glasses at that fancy seafood restaurant in Port Blossom." "What happened?" "I don't know exactly. But apparently her attorney left the table and took the call privately." I closed my eyes. For 7 months I had waited. 7 months of staying quiet, of biting my tongue, of pretending I knew less than I did. And now it had begun. "You okay, Arthur?" Mr. Davies asked. Yo, you're not. That made me laugh. A short, involuntary bark that was the first genuine laugh I'd managed all day. No, I admitted, probably not. Back in the van, Leo and Finn were arguing about where we should stop for dinner. Normal kid stuff. I listened, my mind drifting backward, 7 months earlier. Back to a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Back to a plain white envelope sitting on my kitchen counter. An envelope that wasn't supposed to matter. An envelope I almost threw away. If I had, none of what happened afterward would have unfolded. I would have signed the divorce papers without question. I would have accepted the story everyone told. I would have believed Julian Thorne was exactly who he claimed to be. Instead, I opened that envelope, and my entire understanding of my marriage began to unravel. As we headed north on the highway, Leo eventually fell asleep against the passenger window. Finn dozed off in the back. For the first time all day, the van was quiet. I glanced in the rearview mirror. 2 boys, my boys, the only reason I'd kept going when everything else felt like it was falling apart. At that seafood restaurant, Elara and Julian probably thought they had won. Maybe they were still raising glasses, laughing about how predictable I was. Maybe Julian was already making plans for their future. What none of them knew was that Mr. Finch's phone call wasn't random. It wasn't bad luck. And it definitely wasn't the beginning of their new life. The divorce hearing had simply been the final piece of a much larger puzzle. The real story started 7 months earlier, with a plain white envelope and a secret nobody saw coming. 7 months earlier, my life still looked normal from the outside. If you drove past our house in Port Blossom, nestled just a few blocks from the marina, you would have seen the same things for years. A tidy lawn, a couple of mature cedar trees, my old Ford van in the driveway. Nothing suggested a marriage was quietly coming apart. That's the funny thing about most disasters. They rarely announce themselves with a trumpet blast. At 58, I was recovering from a nagging injury to my left knee, a souvenir from years of contorting myself into tight spaces within boat hulls. The first surgery had given me about 4 years of relief, but the pain had returned with a vengeance. The second procedure wasn't going nearly as well. Some mornings, I needed a few minutes just to straighten my leg after getting out of bed. I hated it, not just for the pain, but because it made me feel old. And when you're nearing 60, feeling old can mess with your head more than people realize. Elara and I had been arguing more often. Not screaming matches, which would have been easier to understand. It was worse. Cold silence, clipped answers. Conversations that died before they even began. Looking back now, I can admit my part. I spent too many years focused on Coastal Craftworks. It wasn't a flashy business, but it kept the bills paid, put Leo and Finn through good schools, and allowed for occasional family trips. Yet, it also consumed a huge part of my life. Too often, I convinced myself that being physically present wasn't necessary as long as I was providing. That was a profound mistake. One evening, about a week before everything started, I came home to find Elara sitting at the kitchen island scrolling on her phone. She didn't even look up. "How was your day?" I asked. "Fine." That was it. Fine. I opened the refrigerator, found leftover salmon, and heated it up. A few years earlier, we would have eaten dinner together, talking about our day. Now we often felt like roommates sharing expenses. Later that night, Leo was doing homework at the dining room table, while Finn was engrossing himself in building a complex Lego fortress. The boys were laughing, a warm, reassuring sound. Elara sat nearby, still engrossed in her phone, occasionally smiling. Not at me, not at the boys, but at something, or someone, else. I remember watching her from across the room, thinking she seemed happier texting whoever was on that screen than she ever seemed talking to me. The thought bothered me, but not enough to start a fight. Not yet. A week later, the envelope arrived. Nothing about it looked important. Plain white, no company logo, no urgent markings, just her name and our address. I picked up the mail on my way inside, tossed it onto the counter, and promptly forgot about it. The next morning, she left early for a yoga class. I was drinking my coffee when I noticed the envelope still sitting there, unopened. I almost tossed it onto the stack of papers she usually ignored. Then something caught my attention, a small return address from a financial services office in Seattle. That was strange. We didn't use anyone in Seattle. At least, I didn't think we did. I stared at it for a few seconds, a prickle of unease spreading through me. Then I did something I probably shouldn't have. I opened it. To this day, I'm not proud of that moment, but if I hadn't, none of the truth would have surfaced. Inside was a statement. Nothing dramatic, no giant secret, no smoking gun, just numbers. Account numbers, balances, transactions. The kind of paperwork most people would glance at for 3 seconds and toss into the recycling bin. What bothered me was simple. I had never seen this account before. Not once. Not during tax season. Not during our financial planning meetings. Not when we refinanced the house. Never. I sat down at the kitchen table and read every page. Then I read it again. The balance wasn't astronomical, a little over $28,000. Enough money to matter, but not enough to explain, especially when I had no idea the account existed. For most of the day, I tried convincing myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe an old investment. Maybe something inherited that she'd forgotten to mention. Maybe something I'd forgotten. By dinner, the nagging thought persisted. Finally, I asked, as casually as I could manage, "Hey, what's the account from Seattle?" Her reaction was too fast, too sharp. Her head snapped up. "What account?" "The statement. From Seattle." Her expression changed for a second, a flicker of something I couldn't quite decipher. Then it vanished. "It's nothing." "Nothing," I repeated, raising an eyebrow. Interesting answer. Then why didn't I know about it? She shrugged, a dismissive gesture. "Because it doesn't concern you." I remember standing there, holding a glass of water, trying to decide whether to push harder. Instead, I let it go, at least outwardly. Inside, something had irrevocably shifted. A week later, I found a second account, then a third. All different, all unfamiliar. The money wasn't vanishing, not exactly. It was moving slowly, carefully, like someone transferring buckets of water from one container to another, and hoping nobody noticed the level dropping. That was when I contacted a forensic accountant. Not because I was planning a divorce, not because I wanted revenge, but because I needed to know whether I was losing my mind. The accountant's name was Miss Anya Sharma, retired financial investigator, 63 years old, with a dry sense of humor and eyes that missed nothing. The kind of person who looked like she'd rather be hiking a mountain trail than poring over ledgers. We met at a quiet cafe overlooking the marina. After reviewing the paperwork, she leaned back in her chair, a faint smile playing on her lips. "You want the good news or the bad news, Mr. Vance?" I laughed nervously. "Start with the good, please." "You're not crazy," she said. "The bad news came next. Somebody is definitely moving money." I felt sick. Not angry, not yet. Just a profound weariness settling over me. Anya studied me carefully. "Do you want me to keep looking?" I stared out the cafe window. Rain tapped softly against the glass. For the first time, I understood that whatever was happening might be much bigger than a few hidden accounts. "Yes," I said quietly. "I want answers." Over the following weeks, Anya uncovered a pattern. Transfers, shared expenses, financial connections that shouldn't have existed. And eventually, one name kept appearing. Julian Thorne. The charming local property developer. The man everyone said was just a friend. At first, I assumed the worst, that Elara was helping him, protecting him, choosing him over our family. Then Anya called me one Thursday afternoon. Her voice sounded different, more serious. "Arthur, I found something." "What?" There was a pause. "You need to see this in person." The next morning, she slid a single document across her desk. I looked down, read the first page, then the second, and suddenly realized something that changed everything. The missing money wasn't the biggest secret. Julian was. And the truth about him was far worse than I had imagined. The document Anya slid across the desk didn't prove Elara was having an affair. Not directly. What it proved was something I wasn't expecting. Julian Thorne was broke. Not the kind of broke most people imagine. He still drove a sleek sports car, still wore designer watches, still posted photos from exclusive golf courses and gourmet dinners. From the outside, he exuded success, but the paperwork told a different story. Several development projects had stalled. Multiple loans were overdue. Creditors were circling. Private investors were demanding answers. The man everyone admired was balancing on a very thin ledge. I sat there, reading page after page. Finally, I looked up at Anya. "Are you telling me this guy is a fraud?" She shook her head. "Not exactly." "Then what are you telling me?" "He spends money he doesn't have." That answer somehow felt worse than fraud. Fraud would have been simple, a clear-cut villain. This was messier, more human, more believable. Anya pointed to several highlighted sections. "See these transfers?" I nodded. "They line up almost perfectly with money leaving accounts connected to your household." I stared at the numbers, my stomach tightening. For weeks, I'd convinced myself there had to be another explanation. A misunderstanding, a bookkeeping mistake, something. Now that hope was disappearing. I drove home in silence, the familiar winding roads of Port Blossom blurring past. That evening, Elara was sitting on the back deck, scrolling through her phone. The sun was setting behind the distant islands, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. For a moment, she looked exactly like the woman I'd married 20 years earlier. And that's what truly hurt. Not the possibility of losing her, but the searing realization that I'd already lost her, piece by piece. I sat down across from her. Neither of us spoke for nearly a minute, the only sound the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. Finally, she looked up, her expression guarded. "What?" Just one word. Not "how was your day?" or "you look tired." Just what? I almost told her everything right there, about the accounts, about Julian, about Anya, about all of it. Instead, I said something else. "Do you think we're okay?" She blinked, and for a second, she seemed genuinely surprised by the question. Then she looked away, back at her phone, though she wasn't scrolling. "I don't know," she murmured. That answer stayed with me for weeks. Not because it was cruel, but because it was honest. And honesty had become a rare commodity in our house. Over the next month, Anya continued digging. Every few days, she'd call with another piece of information. Nothing explosive, just enough to slowly build a larger, more troubling picture. The more I learned, the stranger things became. At first, I assumed Elara was secretly helping Julian, a willing accomplice. Then another possibility emerged. Maybe Julian was using her. One afternoon, Anya called while I was at work, overseeing a delicate keel repair on a classic schooner. I stepped outside, wiping grease from my hands. "What'd you find?" I asked. "Are you sitting down?" "Arthur, that's never a good sign, Anya." She chuckled. "No, it usually isn't." Then her tone became serious. "Your wife isn't controlling this. Julian Thorne is." I leaned against the weathered clapboard of the boathouse. "Explain." Anya walked me through several transactions. The pattern was obvious once she pointed it out. Every time Julian got into financial trouble, money seemed to appear from somewhere. A few weeks later, another payment surfaced. Then another. Elara wasn't directing the operation. She was reacting to Julian's problems, helping him, saving him, believing whatever story he told her. I felt something unexpected then. Not satisfaction, not even anger. Pity. For months, I'd pictured some master plan, some secret partnership, some grand conspiracy against me. Instead, I was looking at a woman making increasingly bad decisions because she trusted the wrong man. That realization complicated everything. It would have been easier if she'd simply been evil. Life rarely works that way. The hardest truths usually arrive mixed with sympathy. A few days later, Leo found me sitting alone in the garage, surrounded by the familiar sense of sawdust and varnish. "What are you doing, Dad?" "Thinking," he laughed. "You do that a lot lately." "Part of getting old, son." He grabbed a folding chair and sat down beside me. For a while, we just listened to the rhythmic drumming of rain on the tin roof. Then he surprised me. "Mom's going to leave, isn't she?" I turned toward him. He stared at the concrete floor, avoiding my gaze. Kids notice everything. The changes in routine, the tension, the missing affection, the forced smiles. They might not understand every detail, but they know when something is fundamentally wrong. "I don't know what's going to happen, Leo," I said. That was true. At the time, I genuinely didn't. Leo nodded slowly. Then he said something I'll never forget. "If she leaves, don't leave too." I looked away before he could see the sudden moisture in my eyes. That conversation became one of the reasons I managed to stay calm later. Not because I was inherently strong, but because my boys needed stability more than they needed revenge. About 6 weeks after that conversation, Elara officially asked for a divorce. No dramatic fight, no screaming, just a quiet conversation at the kitchen table. "I think it's time, Arthur," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I remember looking at the worn oak grain of the tabletop. The same table where we'd eaten thousands of meals, helped with homework, wrapped Christmas presents, planned vacations, built a life, and now we were ending it. "Is there someone else?" I asked. She hesitated. "Not long, but long enough." That was all the answer I needed. I nodded slowly. "I see." For the next few months, lawyers became an unfortunate part of everyday life. Paperwork, financial disclosures, mediation meetings, property evaluations, endless conversations about who got what. Elara wanted the house, most of the savings, a larger settlement. Mr. Davies thought we should fight harder. Sometimes I agreed, sometimes I didn't, because by then, another development had changed everything. One afternoon, while the divorce process was grinding forward, I received a call from a man I'd never spoken with before. His name was Mr. Alistair Finch. He introduced himself as the trustee for an estate connected to my late business partner, Thomas Sterling. At first, I thought he had the wrong number. Then, he mentioned a document signed years earlier, something I barely remembered, something Thomas had quietly arranged before his unexpected death. By the end of that conversation, I understood why Mr. Finch was calling, and why timing mattered so profoundly. The Sterling Trust couldn't release certain information while the divorce was still active. Legally, everything had to wait, which meant I had only one choice: stay patient, finish the divorce, keep my mouth shut, and let everyone believe they already knew the ending. What I didn't know yet was that Mr. Finch's trust wasn't the most important discovery. Not even close. Because during one final investigation into Julian Thorne's finances, Anya uncovered a secret that had nothing to do with debt, nothing to do with divorce, and nothing to do with money. When she told me what she'd found, I almost dropped the phone. The secret Anya uncovered wasn't what I expected. Honestly, after months of hidden accounts, divorce paperwork, and Julian's escalating financial problems, I thought I'd become impossible to surprise. I was wrong. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was replacing a large engine in a commercial fishing vessel down at the docks. My phone buzzed, "Anya." I almost let it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered, "You found something else?" There was a long pause. "Yeah." Her voice sounded different, not excited but laced with concern. That got my attention immediately. "What is it?" "You need to understand something first, Arthur." I sat down heavily on an overturned bucket, the greasy wrench still in my hand. "Okay, Julian's financial situation is bad. I know that much. No, worse than you think." I waited. Then she said something that made my stomach clench. "He's been borrowing money from multiple people at the same time." I frowned. "Investors? Friends?" Another pause. "Family members?" I suggested, recalling the celebratory photo. "Yes, them too," Anya continued. "And women." I closed my eyes. Suddenly, everything started to make a terrifying kind of sense. The lavish gifts, the expensive dinners, the weekend trips, the image Julian worked so hard to maintain. It wasn't success, it was borrowed money, borrowed time, borrowed trust. Anya kept talking. Over the next few minutes, she painted a vivid picture of a man constantly chasing the next source of cash. Always promising, always explaining, always one big deal away from hitting it big. I had known men like that in the marina business. Smooth talkers, charming, utterly convincing, until reality finally caught up with them. "What does this have to do with Elara?" I asked, my voice tight. "More than you think," Anya said. She explained that several transactions appeared connected to personal loans Julian had received from people close to him. Some had been repaid, some hadn't. Several relationships had ended badly. Not because Julian was necessarily a hardened criminal, but because he always seemed to need help. And eventually, people ran out of patience and money. When the call ended, I sat there, staring blankly at the oil-stained concrete of the dockyard. For months, I had imagined Julian as some mastermind, the man who stole my wife, the man who ruined my marriage, the man who took my future. Now I wasn't so sure. Maybe Julian hadn't taken anything. Maybe he'd simply shown people who they already were, or perhaps, revealed the vulnerabilities that made them susceptible to his charm. That thought stayed with me, a bitter, complicated truth. A week later, I met with Mr. Alistair Finch for the first time, the trustee. He was 72, tall, with keen gray eyes, the kind of man who still wore a tie and pocket square even when no one else did. We met at a law office in downtown Port Blossom. He carried a leather folder thick enough to stop a bullet. After introductions, he got right to the point. Your former business partner, Thomas Sterling, trusted you implicitly. Mr. Vance. I nodded. 20 years earlier, Thomas and I had built Coastal Craftworks together from scratch. When cancer took him too soon, I thought most of our business arrangements had ended with him. Apparently, they hadn't. Mr. Finch opened the folder. Several documents lay inside. I recognized Thomas's distinctive signature immediately. Seeing it again hit harder than I expected. Some people leave behind more than memories. Thomas had apparently left behind plans, long-term plans. The trust he created years earlier contained ownership interests connected to future business opportunities. Opportunities nobody expected to become valuable, especially not during the upheaval of a divorce. Mr. Finch folded his hands on the folder. Under the terms of the agreement, certain information remained restricted until specific legal conditions were satisfied. I knew exactly what he meant. The divorce. Until the decree became final, no one, not even me, could discuss the specific details. Everything had to wait. That timing, he emphasized, would prove important. Very important. For months, I carried that knowledge without telling anyone. Not Finn, not Leo, not even Mr. Davies, my attorney, knew every intricate detail. The hardest part wasn't keeping the secret. The hardest part was listening to people assume I was losing everything. Neighbors in Port Blossom talked. Family members talked. Some former friends quietly disappeared, uncertain how to navigate the social currents of a crumbling marriage. A few people even acted like my life was basically over, a shipwreck beyond repair. It was funny, and deeply painful, how quickly people measured your worth by your circumstances. One evening, shortly before the final hearing, Leo found me sitting on the back deck, watching the last of the fishing boats return to harbor. You okay, Dad? I forced a smile. Sure. He laughed immediately. That means no. Smart kid. He sat beside me, his long legs dangling over the railing. For several minutes, neither of us spoke, just listening to the distant clang of boat rigging. Then he asked, Are you scared? I thought about lying, about putting on the brave face I usually did for them. Instead, I told him the truth. Yeah. Of your mom, no. But of starting over. I looked out toward the dark, vast expanse of the ocean. Yeah, I am. That seemed to surprise him. But you've done hard stuff before. I know. Then why are you scared? Because I was 58. Because my knee still ached every morning. Because retirement wasn't as close as I wanted it to be. Because losing a marriage feels different when you're young than when you're approaching 60. Because rebuilding takes energy. And energy isn't something older people take for granted. Instead of saying all that, I simply shrugged. Guess I'm human, son. Leo nodded, thoughtful. Then he said something that resonated deeply within me. You always tell us not to quit just because something's hard. Kids have a way of throwing your own advice back at you, cutting through all the adult complexities to the simple, undeniable truth. I laughed, a genuine, heartfelt sound this time. Fair point, Leo, fair point. The final hearing arrived 3 weeks later. Elara seemed confident, almost triumphant. Julian wasn't there, nor were most of her family members. But afterward, as I would later learn, everyone gathered at the captain's table, a popular seafood restaurant, to celebrate. I didn't know every detail, only what Leo accidentally received through that family group message. The photo, the smiles, the champagne, the victory lap. Meanwhile, I was driving north with my sons, trying to figure out where life went next. Then Alistair Finch made the call. Exactly as planned, legally properly, at precisely the moment he was finally allowed to. The call reached Elara's attorney while everybody was eating dinner at the captain's table. Mr. Finch later told me what transpired. The attorney listened intently, asked probing questions, then excused himself from the table, taking the call privately outside. He listened some more, his expression growing grimmer, and slowly realized two things. First, my ex-wife had voluntarily surrendered any future claim to a trust she never bothered investigating, a significant asset connected to Thomas Sterling's estate. Nothing illegal, nothing hidden, just ignored, dismissed as irrelevant during the rush of the divorce proceedings. Second, several ongoing concerns connected to Julian Thorne's finances were becoming far more serious than anyone, including Elara, realized. By the time the attorney returned to the table, the celebratory mood had evaporated like mist in the morning sun. Nobody was raising glasses anymore. Questions started, tentative at first, then more urgent. Confusion followed, then a palpable worry descended over the table. A few minutes later, Mr. Davies called me from his car, his voice buzzing with barely contained satisfaction. "Arthur, you should have seen their faces." I couldn't help but smile. Not because they were suffering, not out of malice, but because, for the first time, cold, hard facts were finally replacing assumptions and carefully constructed narratives. For months, people believed they knew the story, the easy, comfortable version. Now they weren't so sure. I thought that would be the end of it, the satisfying conclusion to a long and painful chapter. I was wrong, because the following morning, Julian Thorne vanished. No calls, no texts, no social media posts, nothing. And when people finally figured out where he'd gone, the truth was even stranger than anyone expected. The morning after the divorce, Julian Thorne disappeared. At first, nobody in Port Blossom thought much of it. People have jobs, meetings, travel plans, life happens. But by noon, Elara had called him 6 times. No answer. By 3 o'clock, she was calling mutual friends, her voice growing increasingly frantic. By evening, people started asking questions. The next morning, even more questions surfaced. His office in the town square was closed, locked tight. His assistant didn't know where he was. Several investors couldn't reach him either, their calls going straight to voicemail. The rumors started immediately. In a town like Port Blossom, where everyone knew everyone, rumors traveled faster than the tide. One person said Julian had left the state. Another claimed he was hiding from creditors. Someone else swore they'd seen him at the ferry terminal with a packed bag. Nobody knew anything for certain. What everyone did know was this. The confident man who'd spent years presenting himself as successful had suddenly become very difficult to find. A week later, Elara called me. Almost. But we had 2 sons together. 2 boys who needed stability, and that changed things. "Hello," I said, my voice neutral. For a few seconds, she said nothing, only the faint static of the phone line. Then, finally, "Have you heard from Julian?" Straight to the point. "No, I haven't." Another pause. "I thought maybe he would have contacted you." Her voice faded, tinged with an uncertainty I hadn't heard in months. Not angry, not defensive, just tired. "I haven't spoken to him, Elara," I repeated. That part was true. The conversation ended quickly, but after hanging up, I sat quietly in my kitchen for several minutes. I expected satisfaction, a surge of vindication. Instead, I felt something closer to sadness, a quiet ache. 20 years. That's a long time to share your life with someone. To build dreams and raise a family. Even after everything that happened, seeing her confused and alone wasn't nearly as enjoyable as I once imagined it would be. A few weeks passed. School started again, a new routine. Leo and Finn adjusted better than I expected. Not perfectly, there were still moments of quiet sadness, but better. We settled into new rhythms. Wednesday night board games, Saturday grocery trips, Sunday morning hikes up Lookout Point. Small things. The kind of ordinary moments that slowly, patiently rebuild stability. One Saturday morning, Finn helped me make pancakes. Mostly, he made a mess. Flour ended up everywhere. At one point, he accidentally dropped an egg on the floor. We both stared at it, then suddenly burst into laughter. Real, unrestrained laughter. The first I'd heard from him in a while. Those moments mattered more than any legal victory ever could. Around the same time, Julian's situation became increasingly public. Nothing dramatic, no handcuffs, no police raids. Nothing you'd see in a movie. Just reality catching up. Several development projects failed spectacularly. Investors demanded answers. Business partners began distancing themselves, eager to escape the fallout. The carefully curated image he'd spent years creating started falling apart, brick by meticulously placed brick. And when image is all you have, that's a dangerous thing. Then something unexpected happened. About 6 weeks after the divorce, I received an invitation. The annual Port Blossom Children's Foundation fundraiser, a charity event held every fall. I attended most years because Coastal Craftworks donated repair services for several of their fundraising events. Normally, I would have skipped it, content to make a donation and stay home. But this year felt different. Mr. Davies, my attorney, actually convinced me to go. "You've spent a year hiding, Arthur," he said during one of our calls. "I'm not hiding," I protested. "Sure you are," he countered. I hated when he was right. The fundraiser took place at a large banquet hall near the waterfront. About 300 people attended: business owners, community leaders, local families, retirees. The usual crowd. I almost turned around in the parking lot. Part of me still hated walking into rooms where people knew my personal business, where I could feel their whispered judgments. But Leo, seeing my hesitation, simply said, "Dad, what?" "Stop overthinking." Apparently, wisdom sometimes comes from teenagers. Inside, people greeted me warmly, warmer than I expected. Several former employees stopped to shake my hand, asking about the boys. A few local business owners, friends from the marina, asked how I was doing. Nobody mentioned the divorce, not directly, and I appreciated that unspoken courtesy. About 30 minutes into the evening, I spotted Elara. She was standing near one of the back tables, alone. No Julian, no celebratory entourage, no triumphant glow. Just a woman holding a glass of water, looking distinctly uncomfortable, almost fragile. For a second, I barely recognized her, not physically but emotionally. She looked utterly exhausted. The event continued. Dinner was served. Speeches began. Then something happened that I never saw coming. One of the Children's Foundation board members, a local doctor I knew, stepped onto the stage. He spent several minutes thanking local donors and volunteers. Then he started recognizing community businesses that had quietly supported the hospital over the years. Coastal Craftworks was one of them. I expected a quick mention, nothing more. Instead, the speaker shared a story. Years earlier, during a particularly brutal winter storm, one of the hospital's critical refrigeration systems had failed unexpectedly, threatening vital medical supplies. The repair, he recounted, happened overnight in freezing conditions. No press release, no recognition, he said. Just people doing their jobs, driven by a quiet commitment to our community. I remembered that night immediately. Deep snow, a 12-hour repair, free of charge. I hadn't thought about it in years. Then the speaker said something that surprised me. Some people help because they want attention. Others, he paused, smiling warmly, help because they believe it's simply the right thing to do. Several heads turned toward my table. I felt my face getting warm, a blush creeping up my neck. The room applauded politely. I wanted to disappear. Then things became even more emotional. Without warning, Leo stood up from our table. My heart nearly stopped. He wasn't scheduled to speak. Nobody had asked him to. He simply stood, a tall, slender figure in the hushed room. The conversations gradually died down, the room becoming utterly silent. "Dad won't say this himself," he began, his voice surprisingly steady for a moment. Oh no. Immediately I knew this wasn't going where I wanted. People smiled. A few laughed softly, trying to ease the tension. Leo continued, his voice gaining strength. "This year wasn't easy for our family. You could have heard a pin drop. But no matter what happened, he showed up." His voice shook slightly. Every game, every practice, every bad day. I stared at the tabletop, completely caught off guard, my throat tight. He never quit on us. The silence that followed felt enormous, weighted with unspoken truths. Then applause began again, stronger this time, longer, a wave of genuine warmth. I looked across the room. Elara was crying, not dramatically, but quietly. Her head bowed over the table, and for the first time since the divorce, I understood something profoundly simple. This was never about money, never about the house, never about Julian Thorne. The real loss for all of us wasn't financial. It was personal. A few days later, there was a tentative knock at my front door. I opened it. Elara stood on the porch alone. No lawyer, no family, no excuses, just her, looking older than I remembered. Not physically, but as if life had simply caught up with her, etched lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the same way it had caught up with me. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she asked the question I never expected to hear. Can we talk? Arthur? I stepped aside. Sure, Elara. She walked into the house slowly. This wasn't the house we'd shared for years. After the divorce, I'd rented a smaller place, a cozy cottage in Harbor View, just a few miles down the coast. Nothing fancy. 2 bedrooms upstairs for the boys, a small office, a back patio overlooking a patch of wildflowers. Enough. At my age, enough had started sounding much better than more. She sat at the kitchen table, a simple pine affair, the same table where Leo did homework most evenings, where Finn left cereal crumbs every morning, no matter how many times I reminded him. Ordinary life. The kind I'd spent the last several months rebuilding. I poured coffee for both of us. She wrapped her hands around the warm mug. For a while she simply stared into its depths, as if searching for answers. Then she spoke. Arthur, I owe you an apology. I didn't respond, not because I wanted to punish her, but because I wanted her to finish. To say what she needed to say without interruption. I don't expect forgiveness, she added, her voice barely a whisper. Another pause. I sat across from her, waiting. She took a long, shaky breath. When we first started having problems, I was angry. I felt invisible. I nodded. That wasn't exactly breaking news. And instead of dealing with it, I started talking to someone who made me feel important. Julian. Neither of us said his name. We didn't need to. She looked down at her hands. Then I kept making worse decisions. There it was. Not excuses, not blame, just truth. For years, I'd imagined this conversation, replayed it countless times in my head. In those fantasies, I always won. I delivered some brilliant, scathing speech. She realized everything. Justice was served. The end. Real life wasn't like that. Real life, more often than not, is usually just 2 tired people sitting across from each other, trying to understand how things went so profoundly wrong. I wasn't a great husband either, Elara, I said, the words surprising even myself. She looked up, startled. You don't have to do that, Arthur. I'm not doing anything. I shrugged. I worked too much. That wasn't an excuse. It was a fact. I missed things. Another fact. Not because I didn't care. I know, she said, her voice soft. For the first time in years, neither of us was defending ourselves. We were simply talking, truly talking. The conversation lasted almost 2 hours. Sometimes difficult, sometimes uncomfortable, a few times emotional. There were long stretches of silence, too. The kind that used to scare me, used to symbolize the growing chasm between us. Now, they felt honest, a shared space for reflection. Eventually, the subject turned to Julian Thorne. She laughed once, a short, tired sound devoid of humor. I really thought I knew him. So did a lot of people, Elara. That made her smile for the first time all afternoon. Not a happy smile, but a human one. The kind people have when they finally stop pretending. Do you know what the worst part is? She asked. What? I spent so much time blaming you that I stopped paying attention to my own choices. That sentence hung in the small kitchen, resonating with a quiet power, because it was true, not just for her, but for me too. We all do it sometimes. It's easier to point outward than inward. Easier to find villains than to accept responsibility. As evening approached, painting the sky in soft twilight hues, she stood to leave. At the door she hesitated, then turned back. She said something I'll always respect, something that cut through all the bitterness. Thank you for taking care of the boys, Arthur. I almost laughed. They're my boys, Elara. I know, she said, her eyes filling, slightly. Still after she left, I stood on the porch watching her drive away. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, just a profound sense of acceptance. Some stories don't end with enemies destroying each other. Sometimes they end with people finally seeing the truth. A year passed, then another. Life became quieter, simpler. The Sterling Trust eventually matured exactly as Alistair Finch predicted. Financially, I was comfortable, not rich but comfortable. Honestly, that was more than enough. I reduced my workload at Coastal Craftworks, selling a significant portion of the company to 2 younger managers I'd spent years mentoring. My knee never became perfect, it probably never will, but it improved. Most mornings, I could walk without thinking about it. That, at my age, felt like a victory. Leo graduated high school, accepted into a marine engineering program at a university up the coast. Finn, to my amusement and occasional exasperation, discovered a talent for woodworking, and somehow turned my garage into a sawdust factory, crafting intricate models of sailing ships. The boys spent time with both parents, as it should be. Their mother worked hard to rebuild those relationships, and to her credit, she did. Not perfectly, nobody does, but sincerely. Julian Thorne drifted out of everyone's lives, a cautionary tale that eventually faded into the background. Port Blossom eventually found new gossip. It always does. One evening, about 2 years after the divorce, I found myself sitting beside a quiet cove near the old lighthouse with both boys. The sun was setting, casting long golden shadows across the water. The air was calm, carrying the faint scent of salt and seaweed. Nobody was saying much. We'd spent the afternoon fishing, mostly unsuccessfully. Finn finally broke the comfortable silence. "Dad? Yeah, buddy, you seem happier." I looked out across the shimmering water, thinking about everything that had happened. The marriage, the betrayal, the anger, the fear, the rebuilding, the long winding road back. Then I smiled, a genuine, easy smile that reached my eyes. "I think I am, Finn. I really think I am." The funny thing is, the revenge I imagined at the beginning never really happened. Nobody got destroyed. Nobody got publicly humiliated. Nobody lost everything in a dramatic courtroom battle. What happened instead was something better. The truth came out. People face consequences for their choices, and I stopped allowing other people's choices to control my peace. That, I realized, turned out to be worth far more than any courtroom victory. If there's one thing I learned through it all, it's this. You can't always stop someone from hurting you, but you can always decide what happens next. And sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is build a life so solid, so filled with genuine purpose and love, that the betrayal no longer defines it. If you've ever had to start over after disappointment, loss, or betrayal, I hope you found your footing again too.